remove Sharia, remove Islam, foreign powers using those minority populations against him. The Americans have said to me that I have to remove Sharia. Western powers act against any whiff that Islam might be part of the government. They're interested in making sure that Islam never manifests itself politically.
Why care about what the West thinks in the first place? Here we go. He's already compromised on Sharia.
Bashar al-Assad massacred tens of thousands of Syrian women. Jeremy Bowen didn't ask about them first. You're more interested in alcohol and the flesh of Syrian women.
Are you still convinced that Turkey was not the power behind this revolution?
I think that many people ascribe an omnipotence to the US that belongs solely to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. I didn't do the jihad fi sabilillah, but I'm going to tell the mujahideen how it should be done. Islam is central to US foreign policy in the region.
In this second session of our 2024 roundup, we have Sami Hamdi back on the show to discuss Syria in some more detail. Syria is in many ways a ray of hope, but also raises all sorts of uncertainties for all of us. What path will the revolution take? How do we assess Jolani and the rebel movement? What are the demands of the regional and global actors, ideological and otherwise? And how does Syria navigate Israel's anxieties about the new government and its Islamic colour? Sami Hamdi, Jazakallah khair once again, and welcome back to The Thinking Muslim.
Thank you for having me.
Sami, the last time we spoke, we looked at Gaza, and we looked at a whole array of issues that the Muslim Ummah had to grapple with in 2024, and you gave some nuggets of hope, I suppose, for 2025. Today, what I want to do is focus very specifically on the Syria challenge, because I think it warrants a show in itself. Now, we've had a month since the rebellion began, and around 3 weeks since in effect, Assad had left Damascus, and now we have a rebel government, or this new government led by HTS in power. How do you rate Ahmed Al Sharaa's government so far, or his interim government, and some of the acts that he's undertaken?
I think that when you look at the decisions that the new Syrian government has taken, the statements that have come out from its representatives, whether it's Ahmed Al Sharaa, Mohammed Al Bashir, the new prime minister, and these others, I think it's clear that the overwhelming focus or priority at the moment is how to ease the tensions, or ease the concerns, or ease any anxieties amongst minority groups within Syria itself. I think the reason for that is that the analysis of the new government is that the backlash from foreign powers will not be manifested by a foreign army, but will be manifested by taking advantage of any anxiety amongst the minority groups to use it as a casus belli, or to use it as an excuse to either continue sanctioning the government in Damascus, or to use it as an excuse to start arming militias, or to use their anxiety as an excuse as to strong arm the government in Damascus. And I think what the focus of this government is to try to assure these minorities that, oh, Alawis, there's no need to go to Iran. We're not going to take revenge on you for what Assad did. Oh, Christians, there's no need for you to go to the US or to go to Russians. We're going to protect you. We're going to allow you to celebrate Christmas. We'll even make it a public holiday and add an extra public holiday, something that even Western governments don't do. Muslims are larger in terms of percentage here in the UK. The UK government doesn't make Eid a public holiday. Ahmed Al Sharaa has gone above and beyond even Western governments to reassure minorities that there will be nothing done to harm them and they will be safe. And even videos that went viral of Christmas trees being burnt or the like, it turned out that it was a fake video, and there were videos instead of his fighters providing security for Christians to do Christmas. I think the reason why Ahmed Al Sharaa is so focused on this is that even when you look at the headlines, Candace Owens' immediate reaction to Syria was Christians are about to be killed. The immediate concern was over the shrine of Sayyidina Zainab. So Ahmed Al Sharaa ended up sending troops there in order to prevent anybody from violating that particular shrine. And I also think that when you look at the statements coming out from Israel, which said that we need to go and support the Kurds now in order to prevent them from being under the fold of Damascus, Ahmed Al Sharaa is trying now to appeal also to the Kurds to say we have no problems with them whatsoever. The SDF needs to put down its arms. There's suggestions of discussions between them. Erdogan wants to crush them. But the idea being is that what is the greatest threat that I am facing now immediately. And Ahmed Al Sharaa believes the greatest threat is not minority populations, but foreign powers using those minority populations against him. And he's trying to cut the road by going to them directly in Aleppo and the like and telling them, I'm going to look after you. You're going to be safe. Whatever fears you have about Islam, I assure you that any policy that we make will not harm you. And so far, at least from the statements coming out from the leaders of these minority groups, it does appear to be working.
I mean, is that Ahmed Al Sharaa being clever, or do you think that he's overcompensating here and it's a bit too much?
The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, I don't want to compare him to the current leadership in Syria, but rather using it as a maxim or a rule. Before he enters Quraysh, he gives amnesty or gives security to the leader of Quraysh, Abu Sufyan.
Yes.
And he announces that anybody who stays in their home is safe and anybody in the home of Abu Sufyan is safe. And remember, Abu Sufyan is an individual who, when he meets with the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam beforehand in order to discuss the surrender of Quraysh, Umar al-Khattab wants to chop off Abu Sufyan's head, and so do some of the other Sahaba. It's Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam who comes out and says that he's safe when he's there. I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with the idea of trying to reassure the civilian population that the age of war is truly finished. Remember, Ahmed Al Sharaa has entered Damascus, him and his groups, as an umbrella force of more than 26, 27 different factions, according to reports. Ahmed Al Sharaa has to try to, how do I unite these 26, 27 different factions? How do I, if I look at Tunisia and Egypt, UAE and Saudi Arabia ran wild in trying to topple the democratically elected governments over there. How can I reassure them? There's the aim of the game for Ahmed Al Sharaa at this moment in time is, I need to make sure I shut the doors of where the fitna can come from, where these issues can come from. I think that some have accused him of overcompensating, although I don't necessarily agree. I think merely if we make a comparison, I think that he's gone further in terms of providing security for Christmas, which is perfectly fine. We have reports of the Jews celebrating their holidays in Medina and the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ asking about that, which is where we got the fasting for Ashura. When he asked, why are you celebrating? He said, this is the day Musa was saved. And he said, we are, you know, we have a more primacy to Musa alayhi salam. Yeah. We will fast on this day. But the point is here, they were celebrating it. I don't think there's anything wrong in that. I do think that the addition of an extra day for a public holiday to celebrate Christmas certainly reflects an awareness of the deep sensitivities amongst Western powers towards any form of Islam in governance and the impact that Islam might have. And I think that when you look at Sudan, for example, when Nimeri in 1984 was threatened by the US envoy, Nimeri added or imposed, not imposed Sharia, but added Sharia to the constitution. Imposed implies the people didn't want it. When Nimeri announced Sharia in 1983 or 1982, the US envoy visited him in about 1984 and said to Nimeri that either you remove Sharia or we will bring you down. This specific, we will topple you. And Nimeri famously, one of his advisors walked in on him and Nimeri was lying down and he said, what's wrong, Mr. President? He said, the Americans have said to me that I have to remove Sharia. If I remove it, my people will hang me. And if I don't remove it, America will hang me. And I don't know if in either step I'm going to be ruined. In Sudan now, one of the reasons there's a genocide is that the Americans want to bypass the Sudanese people by insisting there should be no elections, so that in the 2-year transition, they removed Islam from the constitution and they normalized ties with the Israelis. Ahmed Al Sharaa adding an extra public holiday. I'm not interested in the whole, you know, is it right, is it wrong? Like, that's irrelevant in this particular discussion. Ahmed Al Sharaa is aware that he has to go above and beyond to reassure these parties because they have the power to remove him should they decide to do so. And I think that it's not just Machiavellian. I do believe he does want to bring these minorities together, but I think that those who've criticized him for it perhaps don't necessarily appreciate the extent to which Western powers act against any whiff that Islam might be part of the government. And I think it's significant that Barbara Leaf, the US representative that went to Damascus, some of the foreign ministers, they did press conferences with Ahmed Al Sharaa, or they photographed themselves with him. Barbara Leaf didn't do a press conference with Ahmed Al Sharaa, suggesting that when she came, she set out her list of demands that the Americans wanted, and they went out. And it remains to be seen whether these overcompensation, as your question called it, although I wouldn't call it overcompensation, the overcompensation whether it will actually work or not. Because Ghannouchi did it in Tunisia, and when Said toppled him, it didn't help him in the end.
No.
Morsi did it in Egypt, and Bill Clinton did not give it any consideration whatsoever when she ran to recognize Sisi's coup. I do think that the Americans are less interested in the rights of minorities and less interested in Christmas public holidays as much as they're interested in making sure that Islam never manifests itself politically. And I think when we talk about overcompensation, the question here is adding 2 public holidays for Christmas, which is something that the UK does not do for Eid, which is something that America does not do for Eid, where the Christian population is about the same in terms of numbers. In percentage, I think the UK has a larger Muslim population. UK government doesn't, and I'm not saying UK government should do it, I'm saying UK government doesn't see a necessity to do so in order to allay the fears of a Muslim minority in the UK. It doesn't see a need to do so, nor do many Muslims even demand it. These days you just go to the school, you say it's Eid, they give you exemption, and you're allowed to stay home and to go and celebrate it, which is fine. Many Muslims, they don't complain about this. But if the UK doesn't see a need to do this to ease the minority, why does Ahmed Al Sharaa, in a majority Muslim country, see the need to make it a state holiday as opposed to a discretionary holiday in the way that it is in the UK and the US? And I think that reflects the fear that he has more than a suggestion, perhaps, that this is something that he felt that he needed to do.
So let's get this clear. The fear isn't really about the minorities in and of themselves. The fear is about how the West is going to look upon this new fledgling government. And if the West moves against the government by utilizing the treatment of these minorities, that may undermine the Syrian government and the Syrian state. Okay. I suppose some of my viewers would say, well, why care about that? Like, why concern yourself with what the West think? Surely you've now got government, you know, you know, we don't care about what these people, they want to take us away at the end of the day. And you've demonstrated that through those examples. Why don't we just say, to hell with it? Let's implement our Sharia and let's see what the worst the West can do.
Well, let me push back on the question slightly. I do not think that there is necessarily a consensus that what has been done contradicts Sharia.
No.
When the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ enters Medina, he establishes the covenant of Medina with who? He establishes it with the minority communities in Medina. He established it with the Jews and the Christians. Yeah. And in that covenant is an obligation on the state to protect the minorities against anybody who seeks to oppress them. And an obligation on the state to allow these minorities to live their lives in the way that they have ordained their lives to be lived according to their own book. So it's a proactive obligation that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ has imposed on the Muslims towards the minorities. Now, I know that I've answered the question from the angle of fear, but there is also an angle that I do believe the Syrian government is pursuing, which is that aside from the risk of the Western states, Islamically, if a Christian wants to go and celebrate Christmas, there is no precedent in Islam where the Muslim says you're not allowed to. If the Jew wants to go and celebrate, you know, Rosh Hashanah and these others, there's no precedent in Islam where the state prevents them from celebrating it, particularly in their own quarters or the like. In Andalusia, it was renowned that they would celebrate in their own quarters, which is why in Andalusia, you had the Christian quarter and the Jewish quarter. It didn't mean that only Christians lived there. It meant that Christian celebrations would take place there, that Jewish celebrations would take place there, not because the state sanctioned it, but it's just a place where the Christians used to gather, implying that the state felt itself obliged in order to provide these havens for these minorities to do so. And that's why I think the debate as to whether it's Islamic or not, when I suggest about the UK doesn't do it, I'm not saying that he's done something contrary to Islam. I'm saying that Ahmed Al Sharaa has gone further than any Western state in providing minority rights. He's gone further than any Western value in terms of providing that. And that's why I gave the example of Eid versus Christmas. I've seen some debate amongst Muslim quarters saying, oh, look, this undermines the Islamic nature of the state. But I don't think necessarily that it does.
No, I'm not arguing that. I mean, I can see how, from an Islamic perspective, if anything, this isn't a problem. But more, my question, I suppose, was more, why care about what the West thinks in the first place?
So Let's put it this way. Ahmed Al Sharaa leads a force, the Syrian government leads a force that's composed of 26, 27 different factions. These 26, 27 different factions were unable to unite as one faction against Bashar al-Assad. They remain 26, 27 factions. And even in their agreement to come together, they came on an agreement to operate under an umbrella, but not as one force. One of the things that Ahmed Al Sharaa has been able to do is he's been able to convince most of them to disband and join the army in order to, which is a significant development.
Yeah.
But the reason why I mention it this way is let's flip sides, and let's suppose that we are now American policymakers sitting with Jake Sullivan and Brett McGurk and these people, and we are concerned that Syria is actually free. And we don't want the Syrians to have their free Syria. What's the first thing we do? We don't send in the US Army. We send delegates to go and meet some of these leaders of the factions. We send delegates to go and meet the Kurdish militias. We send delegates to go and meet Iran and to go to meet Iranian militias. And we say to them that Ahmed Al Sharaa might be able, him and his government, to unite the Syrians enough under a consensus amongst one government. This will give him an independence that might threaten the Israelis, an independence that might make Syria into an independent force that might cause us problems, similar to how it used to cause us problems in the 50s and 60s under when Abdel Nasser was in Egypt, and you had these other figures around the Arab world, King Faisal and these others emerging. We don't want that to happen, but our population in America does not allow us to send troops, and Donald Trump is coming to power. Chances are he won't allow American troops to come here. So who do we go to? We will go to Kurdish separatists. We'll go to one faction and say, why did Ahmed Al Sharaa give the governorship of Aleppo to this person and not to you? We want you to have more representation in the government. We want to support you in this representation in the government. We want to boost your civil society over here. We want to send, the organizations, to send them to US universities so they can go back and we can show them how it should be done. We want you to go to the streets and demand more secular rights. We want banners for a secular state. We want popular upheaval. We want think tanks to talk about how Ahmed Al Sharaa's governance is going to cause problems with regards to minority rights and it might lead. And then we want, of course, social media campaigns to give examples of how minorities have been oppressed in the past. And therefore, all of a sudden, you have a poor Miskeen Syrian who is amongst one of those minorities, who has no objective reason to fear, but now suddenly fears because of the movie that has been painted. And now when the protest rises up, and when somebody fires one bullet and the security forces respond and fire a bullet, and then the media cover that exchange, and suddenly it becomes a violent force that is being used. So you have another protest, not for the minority, but a protest against the security forces using force against protests, and this is against rights or the like. The security force doesn't know what to do, neither does the government, and it cascades until you have another crisis instead. What Ahmed Al Sharaa is worried about, he's worried about this cascading of events, because this is what happened in Tunisia, where you had the growth of so-called civil society, where money was pumped in from outside, where we had new think tanks, new NGOs, we had new charities, we had new thinking emerging that was heavily back, that didn't reflect the sentiments of the population, which consistently voted for the government. The same thing that we saw in Egypt. We saw this funding of civil society. Ahmed Al Sharaa is concerned that in this very nascent period, in this very early period, in this period where everybody is asking questions because they don't know, the certainty is not there, the assurances are not there, I think that the aim at this moment in time is, how can I ensure that a West that doesn't have the appetite to get involved directly, how can I ensure that the West can stay off my back while I focus on what's happening in Syria itself? And the final point that is worth mentioning here is, one shouldn't underestimate that the power of the West in its ability to topple governments in the region lies not in its military force. It lies in its ability to prey on anxieties within Muslim societies. It lies on its ability to find a collaborator. It lies on its ability to present an argument that can convince a seemingly innocent individual and say, yes, I know your Sunni Syrian friend is your friend today, but did you know they're the majority? If they all turned on you one day, you Shia, you'd be in serious trouble. Oh my goodness. And then Iran comes and says, we can help to prevent that situation from happening. Here's a gun, here's some money, come to Qom, go back to Syria, form a militia, here's some flags that you can wave. Oh my God, they're coming after you. You have to go and attack them. Often evil, people don't start evil. It's often a trend in which people eventually go on a path that leads them to it. And that's what I think Ahmed Al Sharaa is concerned about more than anything else. Because, and I give you a much better example, and I promise this is the final example I give. When we look at the fact of the Shia militias that slaughtered in Iraq and Syria, when you talk to Shia population, they tell you, but Sami, look what Saddam did to us. Look what these people did to us before. You're like, okay, but Sunnis condemn that wrong. That doesn't justify the wrong that these militias do. Instead, there has to be a third way. Ahmed Al Sharaa and indeed the Syrian government at this moment in time want to cut off the road that will allow Western powers to prey on legitimate, unfounded but legitimate, understandable fears, wants to cut off the road of them playing on those fears, and wants to say to the Syrian society, I'm not here to kill anyone. I'm not here to oppress anyone. I'm not here to eradicate Christians. I'm not here to eradicate the Jews. When the Islamic empire spread, Christians were not eradicated. The reason their populations declined was because many became Muslim. It wasn't that they were eradicated or killed. Muslims are not crusaders who go into cities and massacre. Muslims are not Christopher Columbus who goes in and kills the native Indians. Muslims are not the Catholic Isabella who goes into Andalusia and kicks out the Jews and the Muslims. The Muslim heritage and example has always been throughout history that Allah will punish a Muslim who does not uphold those rights. And I think that's also part of the reason. It's not just fear of the West, but also because the model that Muslims are taught is one in which there is a pluralism with Islam at the top, a pluralism that allows these societies to practice their religious holidays and practice their religious rights under the framework of Islam.
So can I then ask you about the Sharia and the framework of the Sharia? Because interestingly, that question that was asked by the BBC journalist, Jeremy Bowen, one of the first questions he asked was about alcohol and whether alcohol will be allowed to be consumed and sold in Syria. And Ahmed Al Sharaa's answer was to fudge it in a way, wasn't it? His argument was, we've got a constitutional committee which will be independent and they're going to decide on some of these big matters. And it's not my arbitrary decision to make. But of course, we know that in the Sharia, Christians and Jews are allowed to drink alcohol in their quarters and they're allowed to brew alcohol. And there isn't, it's not as if even in Islamic society, alcohol was completely banned. It's just banned for Muslims, right? I suppose some people have extrapolated from that answer, and I think it's a mean way of extrapolating, but some people have exaggerated and said that, here we go, he's already compromised on Sharia. So just to take that point, but then to broaden it to Sharia generally, like, would your advice be, based on everything you've said so far with Namiri in Sudan and the way in which the West would never tolerate Sharia, would your advice be, be strong on Sharia?
The reason why I think that question is slightly irrelevant, and I know it wasn't your question, it's a question of other people, is because Jeremy Bowen did not ask those questions out of a genuine fear for the right of alcohol or the genuine fear for the rights of women.
Yeah.
Bashar al-Assad massacred tens of thousands of Syrian women.
Yeah.
Jeremy Bowen didn't ask about them first. Israel is slaughtering thousands of Muslim and Christian women in Palestine. No one is interested in those women's rights. In Iraq, the US army went in and they slaughtered and raped Iraqi women. No one asked about women's rights then. No one cared about those women's rights at that particular time either. When Bin Ali banned the hijab in Tunisia, no one asked about the women's rights to wear hijab. Instead, many called it liberation of the women and the like. When the French would line up Algerian women during colonization, when they ripped off the hijab, they violated the free right of the woman to wear the hijab by removing the hijab and saying, now you are liberated. No one cared about women's rights over here. Jeremy Bowen is more concerned that he won't be able to see the flesh of a Syrian woman and go in order to satisfy whatever fetish that he's after. That's the blunt of it. When you go to the museum in Washington, I think the Natural History Museum in Washington, we have one here in the UK, I can't remember which one it's called, we went once. If you look at all of the drawings of women of the Middle East, they are all drawn sexually provocative and they are all drawn as if they are objects that the colonizer conquered. That is their vision for the women. The idea that the woman might be covered is for them such an affront because they are used to seeing it just openly. They don't like the fact that a woman can impose a right not to be seen on another man. It is absolutely sacrilege that a man cannot objectify a woman. Jeremy Bowen's not interested in that.
No.
The point of the alcohol as well. I don't think Jeremy Bowen is necessarily worried about the Syrian right to impose whether to drink alcohol or not. Because the reality is that the Christians in Jerusalem, they drink alcohol, but that did not prevent them from being slaughtered by the Israelis. Neither did it prevent the Christian Iraqis from being killed. Neither did it prevent secular Kurds and secular Syrians from being killed by Bashar al-Assad either as well. And that's why I think these questions, they hide over a hypocrisy that has become so overwhelmingly obvious after Gaza. They are not interested in human rights or democracy. And the proof is that Syria is more than 85% majority Muslim. Majority Sunni Muslim, if you want to go down that road as well. I think that when Bashar al-Assad, from a minority group, oppressed the majority and by claiming to protect the minorities, people were arguing, including the Americans and the regional powers, that Assad should stay because having a minority secular is better than letting the majority rule. What Jeremy Bowen was actually asking was, we in the UK have majority rule, but God forbid you have it in Syria. We in the US have majority rule. Trump wins, he becomes president, but we don't want you to have that. Because Trump allows alcohol and allows pornography, you might not allow it here in Syria too. And that's why I argue that when the Muslims are posing the question, is Ahmed Al Sharaa compromising or not? Look at his answer. He said, I want to leave this issue to a constitutional committee. What does it mean? It means that he wants, because Islam does not ban alcohol outright in a state, it bans it for Muslims and for not Muslims, let the constitutional committee decide where it can be served. Let the constitutional committee decide how it can be served. Let the constitutional committee decide with a consensus with the Syrian people how and where alcohol should. What Ahmed Al Sharaa was saying was, it's not for you to come to me and tell me how Syria should be ruled. I will have this discussion with the Syrians. I will not have it with you. What Ahmed Al Sharaa was saying when he said in the interview that this is something that is not a prime question right now, he meant, Jeremy Bowen, you're more interested in alcohol and the flesh of Syrian women. I'm more interested in these prisoners I've just released from Sidnaya. I'm more interested in the families who are coming home asking, where are my relatives? I'm interested in those whose homes are occupied by pro-Iran militias and by the foreign fighters that Iran brought in. I want those homes to be returned to their rightful owners. I'm more interested in trying to assure the Kurds who think we're going to take revenge because of what SDF did. I'm more interested in telling the Kurds they belong to Syria too. I'm more interested in going to the Christian priests and telling them that Candace Owens video where she's worried about the Christians, don't listen to her, we're not going to do anything to you. Jeremy Bowen, I'm worried about the integrity of life itself while you're worried about partying, raving, and worried about whether you'll be able to sit down with Syrian women or not. Ahmed Al Sharaa, this was what his answer was. And that's why those who took the answer out of context, I think honestly, in my opinion, people hear what they want to hear. I think that his answer was categorically clear.
Yeah.
And I would caution from making a big deal out of what Jeremy Bowen wants to be a big deal. Syria has come out of a brutal war. Syria has come out of dictatorship. Syria has come out of a state where the walls had ears and the prisons had 3 layers underground. Syria has come out from a brutal civil war that saw millions of people kicked out of Syria, that saw millions of Syrians left at the mercy of the Western states. Alcohol is the least of the priorities for anyone who's in Syria at this moment in time, and so is the bikini beaches or these others or the like. Ahmed Al Sharaa right now needs to restore the rights of the properties to the rightful owners. It's not for me to give advice. This looks like what the government is doing. Restore the rights to its legitimate owners, restore the social harmony of the state, and then bring the people together and discuss what should be the social contract moving forward. And I think what is, no, I wouldn't say concerning. What is worth noting now is many Syrians are not questioning the legitimacy of Ahmed Al Sharaa or this new government. They are not. The only ones questioning it are the ones concerned about Syrian consensus. The only ones questioning the legitimacy are the ones worried about Syrian consensus. And I think that's why it's better in this. And this is why when he said, what do you advise them? I don't advise them anything. Let the Syrians handle their affairs. Let the Syrians handle how it should be done. Because I don't think there's been any point in recent history where the Syrians were allowed to decide what they want. Instead, France divided up their country and made Lebanon into a separate state and did their borders and ruled there and then handed over power to a minority to make sure it wouldn't be a Muslim majority state. We saw the Americans come in and bomb the living daylights out of Syria. We saw Obama come in when he saw the revolution. He said, listen, if I have to choose between a free Syria that might go towards Islam and Bashar al-Assad, a secular tyrant, I'd rather have Bashar al-Assad. And it's very interesting now that the ones who are bringing up the issue of the role of Islam in the constitution are not Syrians. It's pro-Iran groups that were happy to accept Bashar al-Assad but are now questioning the role of Islam in the constitution, saying, no, we don't want these guys as Islam to do so. In the Iranian constitution, it says that the president, not only must he be Muslim, he must be Shi'i, from the Ithna Ashari 12, from the Ja'fari, from Ja'far al-Sadiq, and they have to be fully convinced of it in order to have a right to run for president. Iran allows that rule for itself, but it's lobbying against Syria having something similar. I'm not saying Syria should have it. I'm saying look at the double standards. You have the UAE ambassador coming out and saying in 2017 that UAE's ideal vision for Syria is a weak president, something that bin Zayed would never accept for himself, reducing the powers of the president, that bin Zayed in the UAE would never give up even an inch of power to anybody else. Instead, he's consolidated it. The UAE ambassador said, we want an over-representation of minorities in parliament, something bin Zayed would never accept in the UAE, would never accept a parliament in the UAE, let alone a representation of minorities in the UAE, in order, he says, to establish a secular democracy, secular being the operative word, his words, not mine, and in order to create, his words, not mine, the same way that you did in Lebanon, a paralyzed state, we want Syria to be a paralyzed state. Those who are talking about these issues, alcohol, these, I'm not saying they're not important. I'm saying that when a mother is asking you, where is my son? He's been gone 13 years. You don't sit with that mother and tell her, but ma, I want, but but auntie, alcohol. But auntie, bikinis. You don't say that. You know when they bring the pictures, Iran pre-Islamic revolution, they saw the girls in short skirts and the like, which shows you the vision that they want for it. You don't go to a father who hasn't seen his son in 30 years. They disappeared under the Hafiz al-Assad regime. And he says, have you seen my son? Have you seen my son? Did he come out of the prison? Come out of the prison. And he said, but Haji, did you not hear what he said about alcohol? That's why I think that we should be wary of being dragged into these debates that don't get us anywhere. Syria needs a reconciliation amongst its society. And I'm not too worried about the state of Islam at this moment in time in Syria. Not because I think it will or will not be included in the constitution. I'm sure that it will. I'm sure Syrians will go through it. If they don't, they may end up with the same fate as Egypt and Tunisia. But certainly I believe that when we talk about what the Western states want from Syria, I think that it would be interesting to see to what extent the Syrians are able to dictate their own fate independently of what's happening elsewhere.
Can I ask you about the role of Turkey? Now, the last time we spoke substantially about Syria, there was a discussion about whether Turkey played a part in the initial revolution that led to the downfall of Assad and Damascus. And I think your answer was that Turkey did not have sufficient information at that time to support so Turkey was not behind the initial revolt, but Turkey did have some part to play in the build-up, but Turkey didn't know the timing. Now, since then, we've had pretty high-level meetings between Turkish officials and the new fledgling government. We've had Fidan, the foreign minister. We've had Ibrahim Kalin, the intelligence chief, who visited, and he was driven around by Jolani. And we've had that Trump press conference where Trump basically said this was a Turkish coup. Are you still convinced that Turkey was not the power behind this revolution?
I still think that Turkey did not believe in the initial stages that Damascus was going to fall. I think it's important to remember that in just about a month, 2 months prior, Erdogan was insisting on Bashar al-Assad coming to Ankara, talking with Ankara, lobbying Russia to get Assad to come to Ankara. Erdogan believed that domestically the Syrians were resulting in a very difficult political situation for him at home. 2019, he loses the mayoral election in Istanbul because of the Syrians, because there's growing animosity amongst the Turkish population towards the Syrian refugees. When are they going home? When are they going home? When are they going home?
Yeah.
in the presidential election afterwards, Syria becomes one of the major issues. And Kılıçdaroğlu makes it one of his main points. I will kick those Syrians home.
The opposition leader.
The opposition leader. And Erdogan is sort of holding the stick from the middle, and then right at the end he goes, no, it's inhumane to kick them out. Even though there are reports that he was taking some Syrians and deporting them back to Syria itself, and also that some reapplying of residence permits or renewals were being delayed and the like. I think that Erdogan's plan was that given Damascus is not going to fall, let me try and talk to Bashar al-Assad, come to an agreement with him, and then get those Syrian refugees to go back to Syria, where Assad is still in Damascus, but we've managed to create a safe haven for them in the north, and that way the Turks who are angry with me, they'll calm down, and therefore I will be able to ease the political pressure on myself. I think as part of applying pressure on Bashar al-Assad, I think the Turks were aware that Ahmed Al Sharaa and his allies, his coalition groups, wanted to launch an offensive. And it wouldn't be the first time they'd launched an offensive. They launched an offensive previously. Once upon a time, they got to Saraqib with the help of Turkish drones. And then Turkey felt that maybe they can't go much further. Turkish drones withdrew, Hezbollah came over, and the groups were driven back from Saraqib. Turkey's history is that I want to put enough pressure on Bashar al-Assad, but I don't believe in the capacity to bring down Damascus itself. The reports initially suggested that Erdogan had tried to ask the groups to delay their offensive until October. I still want to talk to Bashar al-Assad. I still want to come to an agreement with Bashar al-Assad. Remember, UAE were already rehabilitating Bashar al-Assad. Bin Salman had hosted Bashar al-Assad in Riyadh at the Arab Summit. You have other regional leaders who are meeting Bashar al-Assad. Iranian foreign minister was with Bashar al-Assad 19 days beforehand. I think that when Ahmed Al Sharaa and his group decided to launch the attack unilaterally, because 3 weeks prior, Assad was bombing Idlib, Russia was bombing Idlib, and there was an indication that Assad might make another attempt on Idlib. I think the groups thought, let's go, we have nothing to lose, we're ready, let's do a preemptive strike. That will surprise everybody. I think that sometimes we forget that these groups also have agency. They're able to move on their own, and I think they moved on their own initially. When they got to Aleppo, I think in the beginning, can they take Aleppo? Can they not take Aleppo? Where's Russia? I think at this point, Erdogan, in my opinion, talks to the Russians and tells them, it's not in your interest to intervene in here. Russia's already tied down in Ukraine. It hasn't paid much attention to Syria. They're asking the Turks what's going on over here. And the Turks are probably telling the Russians, this is just a limited operation. Putin goes, okay, let me go back and focus on Ukraine, where I have a real problem and I'm struggling over here in Ukraine. Then they take Aleppo. When they take Aleppo, I think then the Turks are saying, okay, you took Aleppo quite fast. But Ahmed Al Sharaa is already moving to Homs, or moving to Hama. When he's moving towards Hama, I think at this point the Turks are saying, okay, he took Aleppo. This increases our leverage at the negotiating table. There's no harm in letting him go into Hama, because Putin right now doesn't believe it's something serious. Putin is still focused on Ukraine, so the airplanes are not coming in to bomb them into oblivion. And I can force Assad to come to the negotiating table. When Hama falls and they start marching on Homs, Erdogan comes out and says that Damascus is going to be... I think that's the point where the Turks start saying, actually, Damascus might fall. And I think it's at this point where Erdogan believes that the Russians won't necessarily get involved. I think the Turks were taken by surprise, but adapted very quickly. Your question, when you pose it and say, but the Turks seem to be the primary beneficiaries. They are there first. Kalin is in Damascus first. Fidan is in Damascus first. Erdogan is planning to visit next week from this recording. I think that the reason Turkey has a primacy is because even if the ending was a bit bitter in terms of the rise of racism and xenophobia in Turkey and the attacks on Syrian refugees, it is not an understatement to say that Erdogan is perhaps one of the primary reasons why the Syrian revolution remained alive for so long. Erdogan took those refugees in. Erdogan is the one who, despite Turks being very angry with him about it, Erdogan integrated those Syrian refugees in giving them access to the education system, the healthcare system, the housing and the like. He gave them a haven in Turkey. In fact, the new foreign minister of the new government was doing his PhD in Istanbul University. Erdogan, I think, did this for two reasons. Erdogan could have done like the UAE and gone and quickly made ties with Bashar al-Assad. Could have done like Saudi Arabia. Could have done like a lot of more of the other neighboring countries. He didn't. I think one of the reasons that he didn't was Erdogan had some sort of belief in the legitimacy of the Syrian revolution, and therefore, at some political cost to his own position, continued to support that Syrian revolution. Whenever Assad looked like he would take Idlib, Turkey would intervene. Turkey mediated between the groups. When the Western powers wouldn't recognize Jolani because of him being with Al-Qaeda beforehand and then turning away from Al-Qaeda, it was Erdogan who intervened and said that rather than abandoning them and going to Bashar al-Assad, let me set up a Syrian national army instead that can be marketed abroad. I'm not going to lose faith in this revolution yet. Now, of course, he had his interest, of course, in the sense that he wanted to get rid of the PKK threat in northern Syria, and therefore he had a vested interest in northern Syria. But even if those intentions mean that there's a mixed bag of pragmatism, of Muslim affinity, of a sympathy for the Syrian people, plus a hatred of Kurdish separatism, I think all of that coming together means that Ahmed Al Sharaa was able to last as long as he did. And Ahmed Al Sharaa is aware of that, which is why the first delegation he receives is Erdogan. And it's also why Erdogan, when he now sees these groups finally in Damascus, Erdogan is the one who gets the Syrian National Army to start handing territory back to Damascus. Erdogan sends his foreign minister to immediately give international legitimacy to this new government that the UAE doesn't want to give. UAE is very slow in order to commit. Abdullah bin Zayed, I think, only contacted the new government, I think maybe about more than 20 days in, or more than 10. He didn't want to speak with the new government. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, again, same thing, very hesitant with the new government. Hakan Fidan goes straight in, and the moment those high-profile pictures of Hakan Fidan there, of international foreign minister, meeting with a new government in Syria, the EU sends its delegation and then goes to Ankara to say to Erdogan, we want to be part of Syria, how can we talk to this new government? He tells them, go to Damascus, they go to Damascus. Then Erdogan talks to the US on their behalf, and the US sent Barbara Leaf to Damascus to talk as well too. I think that Turkey didn't know Damascus would fall. But I think given that they were the primary support for the Syrians for so long, consistently, even if maybe it was a bit shaky from time to time, but I think given that Erdogan, not Turks, Erdogan, given that Erdogan's support was so strong for so long, it makes sense he's the primary beneficiary. The Qatari foreign minister went there as well, is now offering finances too. Hakan Fidan went to UAE as well to try to get bin Zayed to tell him, bin Zayed, listen, bin Zayed, please, bin Zayed, look. Bin Zayed, listen, I know what you did in Tunis. I know what you did in Egypt. I know what you've done in Libya. I know what you've done in Sudan. You have nothing to fear from this new government. Just calm down. Don't lash out. Don't do what you did. I don't think bin Zayed is necessarily convinced by the Turkish foreign minister's arguments or the like, but certainly I think Erdogan's primacy in supporting the Syrian revolution has translated in a primacy of access to Syria, a primacy in the long queue of potential allies for Syria, a primacy in economic contracts, a primacy in reconstruction. And I think Ahmed Al Sharaa is being advised by Turkey even on his PR. And I think that Ahmed Al Sharaa's advantage that Ghannouchi did not have. Ghannouchi's ally or Ghannouchi's neighboring country, Algeria, were very suspicious of him. In Egypt, the neighboring countries were very suspicious. I think Ahmed Al Sharaa's advantage that he has, that Ikhwan did not have after the Arab Spring, is he has a very powerful ally across his border that genuinely believes that he needs to succeed and that their interests are perfectly aligned.
I've come across a number of arguments. Let's place it under the conspiracy bucket for now, but a number of arguments that suggest that what has developed here is very much in line with American foreign policy. So I'm going to take each and every single one of these arguments one by one. I mean, the first thing I've heard is that if Turkey is the brains behind this, okay, you've suggested that it's not quite the brains behind it, but it has the greatest leverage at the moment over the new government. But if Turkey has this leverage, and it's a bit ridiculous to say this, but Turkey is a NATO member. And so the argument goes that as a NATO member, Turkey is very much under American control. And so America is controlling this revolution via Turkey and the effective control it has over the new government. How would you answer that?
I think that many people ascribe an omnipotence to the US that belongs solely to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone.
Yeah.
I think that they apply the attributes of Allah to America. Allah is all-seeing, America is all-seeing. Allah is the best of planners. His plan is always successful. America's plan is always successful. Okay. Allah is the one who gives rulership. America is the one that delivers people to power. And Allah is the one who takes rulership. They say America is the one who takes it. قُلِ اللَّهُمَّ مَالِكَ الْمُلْكِ تُؤْتِ الْمُلْكَ مَنْ تَشَاءُ وَتَنْزِعُ الْمُلْكَ مِمَّنْ تَشَاءُ. Allah, you give power to whom you will and take it from whom you will. They have substituted Allah for America, and they have found a perfect fit. It is impossible in their minds that Erdogan might have some agency to act outside of American influence and perhaps even frustrate the Americans to such an extent that the Americans might actually have wanted Erdogan to be toppled in the attempted coup in 2016, that the Americans might have actually wanted Kılıçdaroğlu to beat Erdogan in the elections and they didn't want Erdogan to win, that Biden, when he came to power or during the elections, when he came in, he made that famous statement, we need to work with the opposition to remove Erdogan. And then when the journalist went, oh, he's talking about a NATO ally, he went peacefully, democratically, that when you've got all these Americans threatening Erdogan because of his unilateral actions, when he goes and buys S-400s from the Russians, and when he goes and this against US interests in the Mediterranean, in Libya, when they're not happy at him intervening, when John Bolton gave the green light to Haftar to go and take Tripoli, Erdogan goes in to stop Haftar taking Tripoli. I think that it's a very simplistic black and white approach. I don't think Erdogan is a tool for the Americans. I think he's a frustration for the Americans. I think where the reason the argument has gained traction is because of Erdogan's conduct on Gaza, whereby 40% or so, according to reports, of oil, Israel's oil, comes from Azerbaijan through the Ceyhan pipeline through Turkey. Erdogan could turn it off, but he chooses not to, because he's worried about the backlash that the Americans will give him, and also the potential that the Turks will topple him as a result of the backlash. By that, what I mean is, American sanctions leads to a worsening economy. The Turks won't blame the Americans for the worsening economy of the sanctions. They will blame Erdogan for being, in their words, stupid enough to switch off the oil. And he's an idiot. He shouldn't have done it, even if it's for sake of Palestine, because now we're hungry. We can't go and eat in Taksim Square. We're going to topple Erdogan and we're going to go and give to Kılıçdaroğlu. Erdogan says this isn't worth it. I'm not making excuse. I'm saying his calculation. The reason the argument gains traction is because Erdogan perhaps has insisted on maintaining good ties with the Israelis, even as the Gaza genocide takes place. Yeah. That Erdogan has not deployed the power at his disposal. He continued trading with the Israelis. When it got leaked, he continued trading secretly with the Israelis. When that got leaked, he announced the ban, but not a complete ban, and there were all these loopholes and the like and whatnot. I understand that, but I think that his approach to Israel is different from his approach to Syria. His approach for Israel, he sees certain doom. I take any serious step against the Israelis, I am done for. It won't be an invasion of American troops. They will get the Turks to turn upon me. That's why I always have the argument, the reason Erdogan feels limited on Gaza is not necessarily because of the Americans, but because he doesn't believe the Turkish population, will have his back when the going gets tough because he stood up for Palestine. It's one of those central issues of the social consensus. But in any case, I think that the idea that Erdogan is somehow a tool of NATO or the like, I think that when you look at what's happening in Syria, when you look at the fact that Israel went and bombed all the military installations immediately, suggesting that Israel was comfortable with the state of the Syrian army under Bashar al-Assad. They had no fear of the Syrian army when Bashar al-Assad was in power, but they do have a fear when Turkey's allies are in Damascus and they might be in charge of the military force. Therefore, we need to destroy the military capabilities because Assad, we knew, would never use them. Turkey and their allies, they might use them. And that's why I think it's very poignant. Erdogan, after Damascus fell, stood up in parliament and started reciting the ayah, Inna fatahna laka fatham mubina, starting bringing all this religious rhetoric. Bahjali, his nationalist ally in government, coming out and saying Jerusalem is coming soon. We are putting this route, the announcement of the Hijaz Railway from Istanbul to Damascus. I think that Erdogan is a master of operating within limited frameworks. He is a member of NATO, but he uses that to his advantage. When American public no longer has an appetite for war and therefore is demanding its government to bring the troops home, Erdogan comes out and says, I'm a NATO ally, let me put Turkish troops there. And I think if you were to compare between US troops and Turkish troops, which would the Syrians prefer? If they had to choose, I know Syrians would prefer to have Syrian troops. Which would they prefer? Are you telling me that the Turkish troop and the US troop are equivalent? I admit UAE troop and American troop are the same. I agree. But would you say that the Turkish troop and the US troop are the same? You would be very hard pressed to push this particular point. And that's why I think that with this government in Damascus, Israel is concerned, which is why it's talking about helping the Kurdish separatists. US is concerned, which is why I think Barbara Leaf didn't do a press conference with Ahmed Al Sharaa, because she's not happy with how things are developing, and the US is waiting to see, we'll lift the bounty, but we won't lift the sanctions. And I think Erdogan is the one running around trying to say, look, I'm not doing anything against the Israelis. I'm a NATO ally. I'm your friend. Let Damascus go. Let these guys rule in Damascus. And I think that the Israelis are saying, as we saw 2 days ago, they are saying that Ahmed Al Sharaa is putting on a show, a display of a moderate face, but in his heart, he harbors a desire to destroy us. And they're probably right. I think the Israelis are trying to tell the Americans, and the Americans are aware of it too. But I think the Americans are saying, he's still a NATO ally. Erdogan can't do much. It's not like he's going to march on Tel Aviv tomorrow. We don't have the capacity to stay in Syria. Better Erdogan than Iran. Syrians will never accept an Israeli presence in Syria. The best of the bad options we have is let Erdogan do so. And I think that's where the NATO ally comes to his advantage. Having said that, I do think that many people pay a price for Erdogan's games in this regard. And that's why I always say Erdogan is Muslim in good times and Turk in bad times. He's a heavy Turkish nationalist in bad times, and he's a very Muslim ruler in good times. But I think that overall, I think that this particular argument doesn't hold when you look at the nature of the relationship between Erdogan and the US. And the final example I'll give is, if Erdogan wasn't Muslim, would the ties between Turkey and the US be so strained? If it was Kılıçdaroğlu, a secular, would he have as much of a headache in his relationship with the Americans as Erdogan? I don't think he would, which suggests that the issue has something to do with Erdogan himself. I think many people are idealistic or believe in this utopia that Erdogan somehow will put on Muhammad al-Fatih's armor and go and bang the drums and enter Jerusalem itself. But I think what Syria demonstrates is, if Erdogan has disappointed greatly on one issue, on Gaza, that doesn't mean that he let go of other issues where he felt he could do something. Suggesting that when Erdogan feels he can do something, he delivers Syria. And when he feels he can't do something, that is when he disappoints, such as Gaza. But I think that what Syria shows is Erdogan in his own mind believes in Muslim agency, independence and liberation. Whereas I think when you look at the way the UAE operates in terms of normalizing Bashar al-Assad, normalizing with the Israelis, lobbying with the Israelis against the idea of Muslim governance, lobbying with the Israelis for secular regimes to suppress Muslim majority who want Muslim rule. I think those are two very different approaches. UAE is in a good time, and look what it does. And that's why I think that the comparison between the two suggests that Erdogan is not in the same bracket as some of these other leaders.
Do you think that the Trump presidency, a new Trump presidency, will be better for Erdogan? I mean, he had a lot more autonomy during the first Trump presidency. In fact, there was that whole debacle over the northeast Syria and over the Kurdish Rojava state, which, in a sense, Trump accepted Erdogan's argument and reduced troop numbers quite radically to 500, I think it was. And General Kelly had to resign. So is Erdogan, in a way, looking forward to the second Trump term?
There is a very good article in Al Monitor, I think. It's an interview with James Jeffrey. I've mentioned it before, but there's no harm in mentioning it again. He was the US envoy to Syria. And he was asked about the difference between the Obama administration and the Trump administration. He said under the Obama administration, Syria policy was generally delegated to the army generals, to CENTCOM.
Yeah.
Under Trump, however, he said when Trump came to power, Trump would ask us nearly every day, what are we doing in Syria? Why are we there? Erdogan is on the phone with me and he's telling me that Turkish troops can handle it. Why is Erdogan our ally? Why are we supporting the PKK, who Erdogan doesn't like? Why are we supporting somebody that a NATO ally doesn't like? Moreover, he argued that Trump was always pushing for the withdrawal of US troops and saying we shouldn't be there. You'll remember the negotiations with Afghanistan. Trump literally walked in, appended years of established US policy of colonizing Afghanistan, and basically said, my people want the troops to go home. I'm bringing my troops home. He brought them to Doha and basically told Ashraf Ghani, sorry, no more support for you, and let the Taliban just walk into Kabul. James Jeffrey gave the indication that Trump is not an establishment figure the way that Biden, Obama, and these others. Trump, instead of following the line the way Obama and Biden did, Trump has this unknown wild card about him. And I think what the UAE did quicker than the other countries did in this first administration was they were very quick to realize that if you want to influence US policy under Trump, you don't go through the traditional channels. You go through Jared Kushner or you go to Trump directly. I think Erdogan realized this belatedly, which is why towards the end of the Trump era, Trump started withdrawing troops much to Erdogan's favor and also would allow Erdogan to start going. And John Kelly, in a fury, ended up resigning when he said, why are we ruining US policy in this regard? I think with the return of Trump, I think the fall of Damascus would have been impossible without the prospect of Trump coming to power.
Right.
I think that Trump's hands-off approach and Trump's less ideological approach, I think Trump's idea of why are we getting involved. You remember that famous clip where he said, why are we going to their countries telling them they can't wear the veil? Like, they want to wear it. They want to wear it, he said. Like, who are we to go and tell them don't wear it? Trump's policy of, if I don't have an interest in it, why am I getting involved in it? I think Erdogan stands to benefit significantly from this. I think when Trump is now, I saw one of his cabinet members, his nomination for defense secretary. I forgot his name. But in any case, he came out and he said that we are involved in too many wars. Our troops shouldn't be involved in all of these different issues. We don't need American boots running around there. That reflects Trump's policy. And I think where Erdogan stands to benefit is when Trump decides, if he decides to withdraw those troops, he needs a replacement for those troops in order to appease CENTCOM and these others. He has to rely on the NATO ally that everybody criticizes Erdogan for, which means Erdogan might actually have his way in preventing a Marxist leftist separatist state. The irony that the US would support a Marxist movement, but in any case, that Erdogan will have his way. He'll prevent that northeastern autonomous oil-rich Marxist leftist Kurdish state that the US were hoping to establish and Israel wants to establish. Trump might say, I'm not interested in it. Erdogan go in and Erdogan will be that peacekeeper over there. I think Erdogan stands to benefit more from Trump than from Biden. And I think already from now, the Qataris and the Turks, whereas UAE had a head start before, I think they're already with Trump, talking to Trump, engaging with Trump, saying to Trump, this is where your interests lie. This is where US interests lie. Biden burnt the whole region with his ideological approach. The Democrats burnt the whole region. John Kirby burnt the whole region. Jake Sullivan burnt the whole region. Brett McGurk burnt the whole region. And I think the difference between Biden and Trump, if the reports are accurate, Times of Israel reported that Trump told Netanyahu he has until 20th of January to finish this, whatever he's doing in Gaza. 20th of January is when Trump enters the White House. So Trump essentially was saying, this stuff can't happen under my rule. I want the world to say Trump fixed what Biden broke. I didn't believe Times of Israel initially when they wrote it. But I saw Mohammed bin Abdurrahman Al Thani, the Prime Minister of Qatar, gave an interview to Reuters in which he said it as fact that Trump has called Netanyahu and told him he has until the 20th of January. I think the Times of Israel has also reported that Trump has informed privately the Israeli officials that annexation of the West Bank is off the table. Something that people were saying that he was going to do beforehand. I'm not saying Trump will actually do these things. I'm saying Biden 100% was going to do it. Trump, maybe he will do it. And I think that maybe is sufficient for Erdogan to get a lot with regards to his way. Particularly given, and this is the point I finish on, Trump is not interested in the Middle East. Trump's interested in China.
Yeah.
Trump's main focus is always China.
Yeah.
That's why he's talking about tariffs. That's why he's talking about competition with China. Trump is not interested in the Middle East. Biden claimed he was not interested in the Middle East. And then his Zionism his overwhelming Zionism that he drowned himself in took too much precedence, and he ended up losing the election for supporting Zionism. I think with Trump, he will believe that, look, what's the big deal? Erdogan, NATO ally. We'll rely on his troops. Let him go into Syria. What's this stuff? Why does Israel need to keep bombing Palestine? Let Saudi normalize with the Israelis and everybody keep the peace. I'm not saying normalization is a good thing. I'm saying from Trump's perspective, it's just not a priority. And I think Erdogan will have greater leverage to achieve what he wants under Trump than he will under Biden. Having said that, it was Trump who imposed sanctions on Erdogan.
Yeah.
When Erdogan refused to release that pastor, Brunson, I think his name was.
Yeah.
It was Trump who brought heavy pressure to bear on Erdogan economically when Erdogan threatened unilateral action in a number of issues that upset Trump. Yeah. Trump, just as much as he can benefit Erdogan, he can also hurt Erdogan. And it's important to note that after Damascus has fallen, I don't think those in Abu Dhabi are particularly happy with what's happened in Damascus. I don't think Riyadh is particularly happy. Riyadh very quickly released a number of prisoners. Egypt now is in overdrive mode with regards to PR. Sisi came out and said, I'm not like Assad. I don't have blood on my hands and I didn't steal anybody's money. Ibrahim Isa, one of the prominent pro-regime media outlets, has come out and said, we need a greater representation of the parties in Egypt and we need to start releasing some political prisoners. Ibrahim Isa doesn't say that unless there's a green light from above in order to say it. Sisi brought a whole meeting of all the military brass, suggesting he's deeply concerned that what happened in Damascus might happen in Egypt. I don't think that those leaders are necessarily happy with what happened in Damascus. And that's what Erdogan's other challenge is. He might speak in one ear of Donald Trump. He'll have 3-4 other Muslim leaders speaking in the other ear of Donald Trump, telling him, Erdogan tells you he doesn't want to hurt Israel, but he actually does. Erdogan tells you that he doesn't want these people to be, Islamic or whatever, but in reality, that's what he's doing. Look what he's done in Turkey. I think Erdogan's greatest challenge will not come from Trump. Erdogan's greatest challenge will come from these local regional rulers.
Sorry to come back to the theories around the new government. But it just seems that, unlike Gaza, unlike some other liberation struggles like Afghanistan, there are lots and lots of conspiracy theories around Syria. One of the arguments that some people raise is how can it be that the West was so quick to recognize this new government? They sent their ambassadors. They opened up the German embassy, the French embassy, the British embassy. The Americans visited this past week. The Brits came. There's a queue of Westerners who are ready to recognize government, whereas the Taliban have barely been recognized by the West, and the West still puts all sorts of onerous conditions on them before some very basic diplomatic moves can be made and sanctions can be eased. So there seems to be a difference in which the West is treating this new Syrian government to that of the other governments. Address that, please.
I think first let's address the point that the speed with which Western governments recognized the new government in Damascus suggests they supported it.
Yeah.
When Ben Ali was toppled in the Arab Spring in Tunisia, no one expected Ben Ali to fall. My father is from Sidi Bouzid, where Bouazizi burnt himself. No one expected the protests to swell from the Monday, so from 17 December when Bouazizi burnt himself and started the revolution, to 14th of January. No one thought Ben Ali would fall, including the protesters in Tunisia, until Ben Ali fell. America couldn't save Ben Ali. America weren't expecting Ben Ali to fall. They weren't expecting Mubarak to fall. America was still the first people to talk to a new government. Because America doesn't sit and rest on its laurels. America went straight in and said, okay, something happened, but we don't want to be out of the picture. Let's go straight in and let's go and set out and see what's happening here. Who are these people? Hillary Clinton speaks to Morsi. In the end, she ends up supporting the coup that topples him as well. You're telling me Hillary Clinton brought Morsi to power for 1 year and then brought the army back again. And that's what I meant about omnipotence to the Americans. The second point that is worth noting is that I think that the speed with which they recognize Damascus is because of the threat that Syria poses to every agenda in the region. Damascus fell fast and rapidly. And the suggestion that the Americans supported it would suggest that, or in my opinion, is inaccurate because everybody in the region was preparing for a normalization with Bashar al-Assad. the US Congress were discussing lifting sanctions on Assad. The UAE was lobbying for the lifting of sanctions on Bashar al-Assad. Erdogan was inviting him to Ankara to reconcile with Bashar al-Assad. Bin Salman had hosted him in not one, but 2, 3 meetings, including the Organization of Islamic Countries and the Arab League meetings with Bashar al-Assad. All of the language and rhetoric on Syria was Bashar al-Assad is staying. The argument that the US toppled him would suggest that everybody thought he was staying. Everybody in the region was reconciling him. Everybody was rehabilitating him, and not a single one had a notion that America was going to topple him. The third point is that Israel, what threat came from Bashar al-Assad that the Israelis would have wanted to topple him? The weapons were going towards Hezbollah via the Shia crescent that the Iranians established. Fine. But the documents, when they took over Damascus, showed that Assad was giving Iranian positions to the Israelis so that Israelis would hit them, because he was increasingly frustrated with the Iranians because the Iranians were demanding more and more money from him in compensation for having rescued Bashar al-Assad from his own people. The Israelis never destroyed the military installations in the way they just destroyed them in the past 2 weeks when this new government took place, because they didn't fear Bashar al-Assad Syria. The reason they didn't fear Bashar al-Assad Syria was because they believed that under Assad, Syria was paralyzed. Under Assad, you had the people against the regime, and that battle between people and regime meant Syria couldn't really do anything. So the Israel's ideal scenario was that let the Turks stay in northwest Syria, let the Kurds have an autonomous region in northeast Syria, let there be a different autonomous region in the south that belongs to the Alawi Shia, or the new demographic changes that the Iranians met when they kicked out the Sunnis from the south and they brought the Shia to occupy their homes in the south, and leave Damascus as a paralyzed, impotent government that is unable to control the rest of Syria, where Assad is a puppet either of the Iranians or of the Russians, or perhaps can be convinced to join the Emiratis and the UAE, who can keep him as a puppet for themselves. Israel's ideal situation was that Assad stays in power. US's ideal situation was the protection of Israel, which requires Assad to stay in power. And therefore, the speed with which he fell, I don't think indicates that the Westerners supported the movement or the rebels in taking Damascus. I think it shows that there was an overwhelming complacency in Syria, where everybody, because they thought it was a given that Assad had won, no one was paying attention to Syria anymore. Russia was focused on Ukraine. The US focused on genocide in Gaza and focused on China. Saudi Arabia focused on its diminishing treasury funds as a result of its overspending on Vision 2030. UAE focused on reconciling Bashar al-Assad and committing genocide in Sudan and going to help support Haftar to make sure that Libya cannot be reunited. No one was looking at Syria because they thought Syria is done. Assad in Damascus, we're just waiting for Turkey, Russia and Assad and Iran to split the gains between them. The fifth point that is worth noting is that when people say that the speed suggests that the Westerners support them, and the lining up of European countries in Damascus suggests that somehow they didn't do that with the Taliban. The Taliban initially, when they did their press conference, you'll remember that Zabihullah, when he was giving his press conferences, what did many in the Western media start saying? This is a new language. It's a new rhetoric. It's more moderate. It's not like the Taliban of 1996 who walked into Kabul and then hanged the president in the market square and proceeded to execute a number of other leaders as well. This is different. They've walked in. There's no bloodshed. They've said stop shooting in the air, the way Ahmed Al Sharaa told his people stop shooting in the air. Some of them, they've come out. They brought the Australian Afghan talking in the English language very eloquently. People started saying, hang on, this might be a new Taliban. And then what did the Taliban do? No education for girls. It was a gift. You were talking about the whole Christmas and saying alcohol will leave it to a constitutional committee. Taliban came in and said girls shouldn't have any education. They didn't say they shouldn't have any education until we see what the education system looks like. That second part about reforming education system came from those who wanted to defend the Taliban position. So the Taliban said no education for girls. Imran Khan comes out and says, these guys are going to embarrass us, humiliate us publicly. Everyone's talking about it. He gathers a team of scholars and he wants to send them to go to Taliban to talk with them. Asam Munir topples Imran Khan and Bajwa, and it becomes a whole different issue, and they throw Imran Khan in prison afterwards. But the Taliban instead of continuing in the same veins Zabihullah started, their whole banner came girls' education. And then everybody said, wait, they will deal with it. We had some Taliban figures coming out and saying, we'll discuss it. Some argued that what the Taliban wanted to do was, we want to change the education curriculum because Western education produces fisq and mujun, produces shameless things. Many Muslims said, okay, this maybe I can go along with this. Because at least the maternity education is still taking place, because when a woman wants to see a doctor, what gender doctor does she want to see? A male or a female? She wants to see a female. Then the Taliban came out recently and said, even maternity education for women, we're going to shut it down. If you're a German foreign minister and you're going to Kabul to go and meet the Taliban, what is the first thing the German press are going to ask you about? Are they going to ask you about, you know, what did you talk about? They're going to say, did you mention girls' education? The Taliban shot themselves in their own foot in that regard in terms of international recognition. And the proof that they put themselves into a corner is such, they ended up, their primary ally today is UAE, which has normalized with the Israelis. So the Taliban who fought fi sabilillah, their primary ally today are the Arab Zionists who now support the Israelis themselves because of a calamity that they brought onto themselves that they didn't need to bring onto themselves. Because even Islamically, no Muslim can argue that a woman shouldn't be educated, because it's the women who educate the kids at home predominantly anyway. You don't want a jahla to teach your kids about what's happening at home. I think what Ahmed Al Sharaa is doing with his statements is, he opened a door through which these people could come to recognize him, through which they could come to meet him and set up embassies. Having said that, your question suggests that the Syrian government has been recognized. It hasn't. The US lifted the bounty on Ahmed Al Sharaa, but they refused to lift sanctions. They said, we will not lift sanctions until we see genuine progress beyond the statements themselves. And maybe the Taliban argument could be that we knew these guys would never give us their recognition anyway, that it needed to be something particularly more different or the like. I think that the suggestion that the Syrian government is backed by the Westerners because of the pace of recognition, I think is a blanket statement that is inaccurate and it's not true. The only countries that have recognized Ahmed Al Sharaa so far and his government and Mohammed Al Bashir's government is Turkey and Qatar. UAE is not sure yet. Abdullah bin Zayed has only had one phone call. Saudi is not sure yet. Egypt has not even sent its foreign minister. Jordan is not sure yet. The regional countries are not sure yet. And I think when the Europeans are coming in, I think the Europeans have come in and sort of said, we want to have a role in this. And the Turks are saying, come to Ankara to talk to us first about how we have that role first and foremost. But I think it's an exaggerated comparison.
I've got final two questions for you. How forgiving should Muslims be with what happens in Syria over, say, the next year? I mean, you know, you paint, and it's true that they're in a very difficult and challenging situation. They're battling all sorts of enemies and opponents. They've got ideological opponents. They've got internal problems. They've got half their country which is being wrecked by war. They've got to rebuild their country. Israel is at their doors and bombing parts of the legacy military installations. You've still got 2 Russian bases in the country. You've got a whole array of problems. And then you've got UAE and Saudi that must be conspiring, as you've intimated, against them. How forgiving should we be and how forgiving are you of the strategic moves, let's say, of Jolani or Bashir or of the government in the coming year?
I don't think it's about whether we are forgiving or whether I am forgiving of what's happening. There is a reality of a situation and there are a series of options. And it's about how best can Syrians make use of those options. And I think that everyone is a genius on the bench. I think that when you are sitting in the substitutes bench and you're watching the match being played, it's easy to say, oh, he should have passed there, they should have gone there, they should have shot over here or the like. And then when you're actually going onto the field and you're actually playing, you realize it's much harder to see those options that are available to you. I think that's the first thing. The second thing that is worth noting is that forgiving in what aspect? You're not the one who fought for 13 years to try to liberate Syria. You're not the one who went to the protests when Bashar al-Assad shot down those protests and slaughtered those Syrians. You're not the one who put yourself in harm's way. You're not the one who was put in those Sydney prisons and disappeared for 30 years not seeing your family. You're not the one walking out of those prisons, having to go to your home, go to your sister who doesn't necessarily recognize your face and you have to explain, yes, it's me, yes, it's me. You're not the one going home, knocking on your door, hoping that 30 years later your mother still lives at this address because people don't even recognize who you are, and you're knocking and say, Ma, do you recognize me? Ma, do you recognize me? You're not the one who had his city bombed into oblivion by the Russians and by Syrian warplanes. You're not the one who had Shia militias by the Iranians walking in with these flags who were taking revenge for Al-Hussein, and they take you home and they kick you out and they bring people to go and live in your homes. Now when you go knock on your home like Ahmed Al Sharaa did, he finds another family living in the home and has to ask them politely to go and leave their home. Forgiving of what? What nerve is this that those who sit keyboard critics and turn around and say that we have to do it in the way that we say? We're not fully aware of those challenges or sitting in there in listening to those conversations that are taking place. I'm not saying we can't analyze. I'm saying that the very premise of the question, and I understand that you've worded it in the way that many other people are trying to word it. The premise of the question comes from an arrogance. I didn't do the jihad fi sabilillah, but I'm going to tell the mujahideen how it should be done. I didn't do the fight for what's right. I sat at home and forgot Syria. When there was a podcast, I think, of some professor, I can't remember his name. He said, you just need to get over it. Assad is staying.
David Miller.
I can't remember. He said, you just need to get over it. Assad is staying. Many Muslims today who are talking about Damascus were amongst those who, when somebody says Syrian revolution, they would look you mockingly in the eye and say, what revolution? How can you still be talking about this nonsense? And today they are the loudest in talking about what Damascus should or shouldn't do. I think the reality is, it's not about whether you're forgiving or not. It's about what can you do in order to help the Syrians to advance their cause. What can you do to bring about reconciliation? What can you do to help and support the Syrians? What do the Syrians need that you can go and offer? What can you do in order to help them to get back onto their feet? What can you do to heal sectarian tensions? What can you do to heal ethnic tensions? What kind of narratives can you spread? What kind of stories can you say where, for example, we say, yes, Iranian militias killed in the name of Shi'ism, but we will not kill in the name of Sunnism. All we're saying is, let's come together and move forward. I'm just saying, stop killing. That chapter is done. It's over. Let's move forward and move and beyond. Afa Allahu amma salaf. And this has been one of the main policies of the current government, even though the Iranians right now are still threatening Syria openly and they're very upset about it. But the point that I'm saying here is, beware of this self-righteous, not you, talking to people, beware of a self-righteousness that you believe stems from a genuine concern to Syria, but actually comes from an arrogance where you sit on your chair with your cup of tea on the hilltop while you watch the people striving to survive, to exist, and for a freedom that Allah has blessed you with, but these people had to fight for it instead. The second point that is worth mentioning is, I think where the concern is for Syria moving forward is that what is the identity of the new Syrian state? Syria is 85% plus Sunni Muslim. UAE argues there should not be majoritarian rule. In the UK, they don't have proportional representation. UK have first past the post. Whoever wins in the area goes to parliament. And there's a reason for that. They believe that if we have proportional representation, we will have paralyzed government and nothing will be done. We prefer 4 years of majority and then change that majority after 4 years to make sure that a party has sufficient time to do something. So here in the UK, no one talks about whether minorities should necessarily be represented or not. They talk about it only insofar as there should be a diversity of views within the party itself, but the party should rule with the majority alone for the 4 years, and then the people will decide if they want another party. And that's perfectly fine. The question here is, why do the Western states not want to accept that for Syria? Why does the UAE, which allows no democracy, no parliament, it's just one-man rule by Mohammed bin Zayed and family rule by Al Nahyan, why does Mohammed bin Zayed build Dubai, build Abu Dhabi, build the UAE, and brag about how wonderful a place it is to live and how wonderful of a job he did? Why does he say UAE doesn't need democracy and over-representation of minorities? Why does he believe Bengalis shouldn't have citizenship and neither should the Pakistanis, who are the backbone of much of the UAE society? He doesn't believe they should have any representation in parliament or the like. Why is he going to Syria and demanding an over-representation of minorities. Why do the Saudis, who a Pakistani can live in Saudi his whole life and never receive citizenship, that a Somali can live there and be dependent on the kafala, sometimes even paying the kafil to renew the kafala, that person can have kids born in Saudi who live their whole lives and never have citizenship. But that's fine, because Saudis will say this is our country. I'm not criticizing them. I'm saying this is the system that they believe they should be governed. How can they go to Syria and then say, we don't want majoritarian rule? Saudis have majoritarian rule in Saudi. Emiratis have minority rule over 90% expats, but that's how we do the system there. How can they go to Syria and demand that there shouldn't be majoritarian rule that takes place in Syria itself? I think the fear here is that Syrians want a certain way and they have a majority for it. The world will tell them, you as a majority should be chained while we elevate these groups here instead. And the challenge for the government is this, in my opinion, and this isn't advice, this is an observation from what happened before. In Tunisia, when Ghannouchi came to power, Nahda came to power in first place, they could have formed an Islamist majority. They could have formed a Muslim majority. They had just under a majority. I think they were about maybe 15 seats short. In third place came Arif al-Shabiya, which had 28 seats. Together they could have formed a majority. That majority would have been an accurate representation of the majority will of the Tunisians that didn't vote for a Nahda because they were a Nahda. They voted a Nahda because they said the new Tunisian state shouldn't be one where Bin Ali bans the hijab, shouldn't be one where Bourguiba drinks orange juice during Ramadan in 1970s because he says the economy can't handle the lack of productivity and therefore I'm announcing darura. You guys are allowed to go and drink during Ramadan because we need to build stuff here in Tunis and the like. Tunisians, they said, we don't want a war on the majority Muslim population. We want a state that reflects the majority Muslim population. Ghannouchi said, or the Nahda's policy was, if we rely on the majority population here in Tunis, we can't rely on them to protect us against the US and the West. When they come and they make their demand, we don't want Islam or Sharia in the state. So Ghannouchi, as a gesture, said to the Americans and to the Europeans, I'm not going to make a majority of Islamic tendencies in the government. I'm going to bring Marzouki, who hates the idea of Sharia in the state, and I'm going to bring Mustafa bin Ja'far, who hates it even more. Both parties didn't do very well in the elections, but I'll bring them and form a majority. So they form a government, and Ghannouchi goes and says to the US, Palestine is not our cause. It's not central to us. And then he tells other Western think tanks, Sharia is not important to a society. When Salman al-Ouda, may Allah release him from prison, inshallah, his channel, they interviewed Ghannouchi. And the presenter says, very hesitantly, Sheikh, you said Sharia is not important to society. He goes, no, Sharia is very important to society. Ghannouchi felt, I need to play both sides. The way that there is a concern, Syria might play both sides. I need to play both sides because of the challenges. And what were the challenges? America might topple me through a deep state or through one of these secular parties. And therefore, I need to make sure I keep the peace and I give them no reason to topple me. When he announced that Sharia is not important, when people started buying up MPs, and he didn't put a law to prevent the buying and selling of MPs from businessmen because he said, I don't want to disrupt the status quo. When the election came in 2014, he found that he came second place. He lost a large chunk of people who had voted for him on the basis that he would present some sort of Islamic identity for the state. But he still retained enough of people who said that he's doing it strategically. 2014, a year after Sisi's coup. 2015, Sipsi comes out, the president, and says, I'm going to announce the financial reconciliation law. Islamically, people want justice. They want restitution. This law was going to forgive all of the financial crimes of the Bin Ali regime era. And Nahda voted for it with Sipsi. When they voted for it, in the same year, 4 banks were about to go bankrupt. Now the base that voted for Nahda, they said, you keep saying there's no money to help the poor. You're saying there's no money to give us access to healthcare. You're saying there's no money to give us an unemployment benefit system. You're saying there's no money to continue the salary of a soldier who gets killed fighting terrorism, and those soldiers come from poor families. So surely you can't bail out these banks, right? And Nahda votes to bail out the 4 banks. So the base, they say, Islam tells us to help the poor. And Abu Bakr as-Siddiq said, that the strong amongst you is weak until I take their rights, and the weak amongst you is strong until I give them their rights. Still, Ghannouchi maintains that base. He still has it. 2016, Sibsi comes out and says, hang on, this constitution that An-Nahda voted for says Islam is the religion of the state. But it doesn't say anywhere that I can't make laws that are contrary to Islam. So I'm announcing that we're going to change the inheritance laws. He wanted to do it to humiliate Ghannouchi internationally. He'd been locked up in the presidency because Ghannouchi convinced the prime minister to betray him. And he said, I'm going to humiliate. Ghannouchi tells the West, Islam is not necessarily important, and then tells the Muslims, Islam is fundamentally important. I'm going to humiliate him and force him to take a position. And if he takes the Islamic position, I'll call him extremist. And if he takes a position pro, we can say he's secular, he'll lose his base. Either way, Ghannouchi will lose. Ghannouchi, when Sibsi comes out and announces the inheritance law, head of Ghannouchi's office, Muhammad Gomani, comes out and says, Allah always, so just to clarify what Sibsi wanted to do. Under Tunisian law, if you died, your estate was divided according to the fiqh of Imam Malik, unless stated otherwise. Sibsi wanted to flip it. So if you died with no will, it would be 50-50 between men and women. Islamic inheritance law is complicated. It's more based on on where you are in the family tree. If your parents are surviving, how many sisters you have, brothers, etc. Muhammad Gomani comes out and says, instead of saying categorically as a Muslim, this is haram and it's against the Islamic identity of the state, Muhammad Gomani says, Allah always intended for us to get to 50-50, but maybe we need to be more gradual than this. Lutfi Zitoun, one of Ghannouchi's key advisors at the time, comes out and says, Allah in the Quran gave us the bare minimum, and we are allowed to increase on it as we wish. So that base that was with Ghannouchi, on the basis that he would protect the Islamic identity, started getting angry. 6 months later, Bushra bin Hajj Ahmeda, who is head of the writing of the report of the commission to change inheritance laws, she finally releases her report on how she's going to do it. When she does it, an Imam in Sfax called Rida Jawadi comes out and gives a khutbah, Firebrand YouTube, very charismatic, and he says, this is a war against Allah and His Quran. What is An-Nahda doing? Like, what are these parties doing? So he arranges a protest alongside with some others, my father included, but in any case, they arrange protests. Thousands of Tunisians take to the streets, asking for what? A respect of the Islamic nature of the state. When these protests come out, another come out and say, we're against the change in inheritance law. But Ghannouchi again has lost another chunk of his base because Itilaf al-Karama Alliance, they come out of An-Nahda and they establish a separate party. So now that base that gave him first place in 2011 is sinking year after year. Why? Because he is compromising on the Islamic identity. So he's losing his base, but he's still under more pressure. The more he gives, the more he comes under pressure from the other side. So he's still stuck in no man's land. Then, killer blow. The following year, the cartoons come out insulting the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ from France. Macron is defending it. Erdogan is condemning it. Imran Khan is condemning it. UAE is saying Macron has every right to protect his own security or the like. Ghannouchi's Facebook, a statement comes out. The head of another party today met with the French ambassador, and the two affirmed that French-Tunisian ties are indestructible and they will not be affected by umur hamishiyah, by marginal issues. This base, majority Tunisian base, majority Muslim base, a majority that if they voted in the UK, they would have a majority in parliament. If they voted on the US system, they would have majority in Congress. If they voted in France, they'd have a majority in the Champs-Élysées in the parliament. If they voted in any free democracy, they would have the majority, and the democracy would give them the right to uphold the Muslim identity, even if there were dissenting minorities. The state would have to guarantee their rights, but the state would be the Muslim state under a majority Muslim rule. This base no longer saw in An-Nahda that it was the protector of the Islamic identity, which meant that in 2019, when the presidential election came, there were 8 Islamist candidates, and Nahda had split into 8 different branches, including former An-Nahda leaders. And what ended up happening was Ghannouchi did not win Washington. They weren't satisfied with all of the compromises. He did not win Europe. They weren't satisfied with the compromises. And he lost the base that gave him power in the first place, who supported him on the basis that he would be the guarantor of the Muslim identity. So when Qais Said did his coup, Washington did not intervene to reverse it. Washington instead welcomed Qais Said's rigged elections. Europe did not go to rescue Ghannouchi. They welcomed Qais Said's support to curb migration on the Mediterranean coast. When Qais Said did his coup, Qatar abandoned him, and so did the other. Erdogan said that he failed himself miserably. He didn't rely on his people. He ended up alone and abandoned. Why? Because in that no man's land that he found himself in, where he said one thing here and one thing to his base, he won neither and ended up in prison. May Allah release him from prison. 84-year-old man does not deserve to be in prison at that particular age. The reason I tell this story of what happened in Tunisia is the government in Syria, what Ahmed Al Sharaa's greatest challenge is, from where will he derive power? Will he focus on the Syrian people and the consensus amongst the Syrians, which is the only thing that can protect him from Western machinations? And the proof is Turkey. Erdogan 2016, attempted coup on Erdogan. Who came to the streets to stop the tanks? It was ordinary Turks. Why did they take to the streets to stop the tanks? Because Erdogan built airports in Van. He built in southeastern Turkey. He built in Istanbul. You saw in the last election, the woman said, how long did an ambulance take to come to this area before Erdogan came to power? Now it comes within 15 minutes. Erdogan delivered. Delivered in a way where even people who don't like Erdogan's re-Islamization of Turkey, they still vote for him. Even people who hate that he quotes ayat in the parliament, they still vote for him because he delivers. And as a result, the reason he's so hard to topple in Turkey is because he has enough of a base inside Turkey that even if the Americans want him out, they struggle to do so because of that base. The question for the Syrian government is, where do they believe their power is derived from? Does it come from the people? And will their policies reflect that in terms of keeping their people on board by delivering policies that align with the identity of the Syrians? Or will they walk this middle line the way Ghannouchi did and win neither here nor will they win over here? And I think that is the challenge whenever we talk about what's happening in Syria. It's not being forgiving or not. Yeah. When you look at Sudan, and I promise I won't go on too long about this, but the Shaykh Yuzkar, you know, the Buna Muhammad, one of my favorite poets, Canadian Muslim poet, says, we are all reflections true. So I can't talk about me without talking about you. The stories that I have seen are stories that relate to you too. In Sudan, if you notice, Nimeri was toppled. The Americans said Nimeri did Sharia. They threatened to topple after 1 year. Other reasons helped to topple Nimeri afterwards, but he was toppled after 1 year. Suwar al-Dhahab comes to power in 1985, hands over power to Democrat elections. The winners are pro-Islam, pro-Sharia, pro-Muslim parties. Sadiq al-Mahdi rules for 3 years democratically from 1986 to 1989. The reason he does not remove Sharia from the constitution is because he knows the people will lynch him for it. He knows the Sudanese do not want to see Sharia removed. When Omar al-Bashir comes to power afterwards, Omar al-Bashir is put under sanctions, him and Hassan al-Turabi, Allah yarhamu Hassan al-Turabi. They're put under sanctions by the Americans. Implicit sanctions and then explicit in 1996. But even when they put under sanctions, they know what the demands are for the Americans lifting it. Remove Sharia, remove Islam, split Sudan into North and South, and we will lift the sanctions. Why does Omar al-Bashir refuse to do so? Why does Hassan al-Turabi refuse to do so? Why does Ghazi Salah ad-Din, the foreign minister, not advise him to do so? Why does Uthman al-Mirghani not do so? Why do the other parties that join Omar al-Bashir's government refuse to remove Sharia? Why? Who are they scared of? They're scared of the people who want it, which is why Sudan, when Omar al-Bashir was eventually toppled in a coup by Salah Ghosh and by the UAE and these others. I know some Sudanese, they didn't want me to speak once at a university. They said he doesn't recognize our revolution. I said, it's not I don't recognize the revolution. It's that Washington doesn't believe there was a revolution and Washington had its way in Sudan. So, you know, it's not just me who doesn't believe it wasn't necessarily a revolution. Maybe a half revolution, I'll give it that. But in any case, when Omar al-Bashir is finally toppled, when he holds on to power for too long, when Sudan really feels the impact of sanctions, when Qatar turns its back on Sudan and refuses to help it, when Erdogan turns his back, when Saudi and UAE turn their back, when they topple, what's the first thing the Americans do? They say, these guys resisted us for so long. We don't give them elections. Don't let them rely on their people. I want the generals to agree with leftist civilian parties, with minority parties who will never win a majority in an election. I want the terms of the agreement to give them a majority in parliament, 69%. I think we already did think a Muslim podcast about it. They gave them 69% of the parliament, appointed members of parliament, not elected, appointed. 69% to enable them to change the constitution without having to go to elections. And in those 2 years, they bypassed the Sudanese people to remove Sharia, to remove Islam, and to remove Sharia, to remove Islam, and to normalize ties with the Israelis. This is what the Americans are after. This is what they pressured Sudan for. Sudan had its stories of corruption. It has its issues of misgovernance. It has its issues. It has a tale of its own in terms of things that Omar Bashir did wrong. But that's not why America was not against al-Bashir because it cared about the Sudanese. Europe was not against al-Bashir because it was worried about the Sudanese. It didn't give a damn about the Sudanese people. They do not want, there is a trauma with regards to Muslim states and nations. The memory of the Ottoman Empire is still fresh. The memory of Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi is still fresh. The memory of a civilization that lasted 1400 years, that could not be beat, is still fresh. The presence of an ummah that refuses to abandon its values is still there, staring it in the face. It doesn't assimilate. It insists on its legitimacy as an alternative way of life that can save the West too, which is why it's one of the fastest growing religions. In Syria, as the government navigates the foreign interests, it cannot lose sight of the fact that Syria belongs to its people, it doesn't belong to Washington. Syria belongs to its people, it doesn't belong to Abu Dhabi. It doesn't belong to Riyadh, it doesn't even belong to Ankara. Even though Erdogan is a friendly ally, it doesn't belong to Ankara. It belongs to the Muslims. It belongs to the Syrians. And in its history, minorities thrived, Christians and Jews alike. They thrived when Muslims ruled, and they were oppressed and repressed when the Muslims did not rule. And that's why I argue always, whenever we talk about Syria, going back to the original question, I promise I'll finish on this point. The indication of whether we should be forgiving or not is absolutely irrelevant. It doesn't matter whether you forgive them or not. The point is that we see the experience and what we see over here, what we saw in Tunis, what we saw in Libya, what we're seeing in Sudan, what we're seeing in these other places. Whoever has the people on side is king. Whoever has the people on side is invincible. Whoever can convince the people to march with them, that person is invincible, and no amount of F-16s can get rid of them. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he was sitting with his companions, Abu Sufyan, the leaders of Quraysh, they sent somebody to Medina to try to find a collaborator. When they went to Medina, he came back, he said, not a single one of them will sell them, no matter how much money you give them. Not a single person will sell Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the reason why is that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he would give his da'wah, he would elevate the ordinary citizen and give them as much value as he gave the elites of society. So everybody felt they were part of that society. The challenge for this government is, what is the new social contract in Syria? Will it be a secular, which has a history of oppression? Will it be a secular, Western style, Western desired system that paralyzes Syria? Or will it be a uniquely Syrian governance, uniquely Syrian power that belongs to the Ummah, that belongs to the likes? And this reminds me of one thing that I wanted to mention. After the coup, Al-Nahda lobbying against Qais Said. Qais Said tasks 2 secular liberals to write his constitution after he tears it up illegally. These 2 secular liberals, they go on all the networks and say, we are going to remove Islam as the religion of the state. And we are going to remove Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim from the constitution. Because modern constitutions, they don't have religion in them. What's this Islam it's included in it? Tunisians started getting angry. They started protesting. They started online getting very upset about it. Said began to feel the heat. On the day he was supposed to announce the constitution, he ripped up their constitution and wrote a new one from scratch. The first clause, he removed Islam as the religion of the state. He wrote, Tunisia belongs to the Arab Ummah and to the wider Muslim Ummah. And in clause 5 he wrote, the sole purpose of the state is to achieve everything that Islam came to deliver. which is extremely powerful legally. Forget the fact for a second he's a dictator or a coup, but legally it's very powerful. One of Ghanouchi's advisors of Al-Nahda wrote an article seeking international help against Qais Said's coup. Among the arguments that he wrote that Qais Said has imprisoned the opposition. He wrote that Qais Said is violating the law. Qais Said has done a coup. And amongst the reasons he said why the US and the UK should intervene, Qais Said's new constitution threatens the civil nature of the state by entrenching Islam and the religion. Hemeti, who is committing a genocide in Sudan, when he failed to take Khartoum and was seeking international help, he sent his advisor to Israeli television, organized by the UAE. The argument that Hemeti's advisor gave to the Israeli television as to why the US and Europe and Israel should support Hemeti's attempt to take Khartoum and take over Sudan, he said because, quote, we are fighting in Sudan, this is Hemeti, the RSF, we are fighting in Sudan the same Islamist terrorist threat that Israel is fighting in Palestine. His exact words, we are fighting the same threat that Israel is fighting in the Palestinian factions. Now, Hemeti, when you think about it, why would his advisor present that argument? It's because he believes that argument resonates with Western capitals. How does he know they resonate with Western capitals? He knows because from 2019, when he was the number 2 in government, he met all of the UN envoys. He met all of the US envoys. He met all of the UK envoys. He met all of the European envoys. And from his 4 years of working with these envoys, he found a common message that formed his PR in terms of seeking support for his genocide in Sudan that he enjoys today. And the strongest argument he could give was not that the state is corrupt, was not that the state might have human rights abuses, was not that the state might have secret prisons. His strongest argument was, you need to support me because these Muslims want Sharia. You need to support me because if you don't, Islam will be the main governance here in Sudan, and the Sudanese people might support it too. So the US, where they could have stopped Hemeti, they said, Hemeti, go ahead. Where this issue of Sudan has been raised in Congress, Biden has turned a blind eye because the UAE normalized with the Israelis, and now their lobbying is the most powerful in Congress because of that normalization with the Israelis. When people hear that Islam is central to US foreign policy in the region, this sounds like a conspiracy theory. But the reason it sounds like a conspiracy theory is because our ummah has not inherited the memories of the other limbs of our ummah. We don't learn Sudan the way you learn about the suffragettes. We don't learn Algeria the way you learn about George Washington and the US Civil War. We don't learn about Syria, the history of Syria. We don't learn about it the way we learn about Tony Blair and how he won in 1997. We don't learn these memories. We learn the memories of those who colonized the region. We learn those memories, and therefore we view the world through those lenses, a mix of a lens between the Islam, limited Islam that we learned, the limited Muslim memories, and the memories that we inherited from those colonizers. And that's why the UAE today, when the UAE ambassador, and you might be able to find the link for it, when he says that we in the UAE, which according to its own constitution is based on Sharia, even if they're setting up a casino and the like, he says in Syria, we must not allow religious groups to be represented in parliament. He's saying, the risk of allowing democracy in Syria means religious groups will get a majority. What's he saying, Jalal? He's saying that if you have democracy in Syria, religious groups will get the majority. And he's saying in Washington to CSIS, the think tank, he's saying to them, you don't want that. And I don't want that. And we need to make sure Syrians do not have their way. Do not let Syrians freely choose. Do not let them decide their fate. For wallahi, they will choose Islam. And if they choose Islam, it will bring a calamity on you. So better, he says, to create it like you created Lebanon. Leave it paralyzed.
Yeah.
And that's the final point I want to make here. The Syrians might say, in the words of some Ikhwan, Islam is not a priority here. You're making it a big deal when it's nothing. Ghanouchi said the same, look where he ended. Ikhwan in Egypt said the same, look where they ended. Even now, there was an exchange between my father and Jamal Sultan. Jamal Sultan is a prominent Egyptian writer in Egypt. So they're tweeting. A lot of the Arabs now are tweeting about how Syria should move forward. So my father, based on the Tunisian experience, protect the Muslim identity of the state. Protect it. Because it will keep the people on board with you. The people want Islam as well. So Jamal Sultan responds and says, this stuff is not important right now. This Islam is not important right now. What's important is that he gets the state in order. He gets the state in order. Why is it not important for us, but it's important for the US when they make it their primary demand, that Islam should not be in the constitution? Why is it that they believe the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is number one on the list of demands, and we want to put it on number 20? And that's why I'm saying that be careful what you wish for, in the sense that Islam is justice. It's not different. We talked earlier in the first part about the metaphysical and the political. Islam is justice. Islam guarantees the rights of the minorities. And I know I've stretched my time on this, but just to hit this point home, the epitome of coexistence, when you study at university, what are the 3 places that they give you? Do they give you Boston? No. Do they tell you Washington? No. Do they tell you London? No. Do they tell you Beijing? No. Do they tell you Perth? No. Do they tell you Rio de Janeiro? No. When you study in university anthropology and you study the coexistence of religions and you look for examples of harmonious coexistence, what are the 3 examples that Western secular universities give? They give you Andalusia, when the Muslims ruled it before Isabella came in and destroyed it. They give you Sarajevo of Bosnia, when the Ottomans ruled it, because it was a place where the church, synagogue and mosque could be found within the same vicinity of each area. And the third they give you is Jerusalem, not when the Crusaders ruled it, not when the Zionists ruled it, not when the Europeans ruled it. They say it was the harmonious coexistence when the Muslims ruled it. What's the common denominator of the harmonious coexistence of minorities? What's the common denominator of the religious coexistence of religious living side by side? The common denominator is the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which guaranteed the rights of the minorities in a way that the Torah did not, and in a way that the Crusaders did not. And that's why when people talk about Islam is not important, that is the surrender to the secular ideology immediately. Islam is central because it guided Syria from the time of Muawiyah and the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and it can guide Syria now. And now the greatest challenge is this: where do you derive power from? Will you trust the people to back you when the world turns against you, or will you abandon the people and abandon what is legitimately yours, which is the right to rule as a majority that is afforded to the Brits in the UK, that is afforded to Donald Trump in America, that is afforded to Albanese in Australia, that is afforded to Macron? It's not a bid'ah. They have majoritarian rule. Will you assert your right to majoritarian rule, or will you allow your country to be ripped apart by the false flag of minority rights that Islam always protected from the beginning of history?
Sami Hamdi, I think that's a good place to end today's conversation. Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much for your time today.
Barakallahu feek. Jazakallah.
Please remember to subscribe to our social media and YouTube channels, and head over to our website thinkingmuslim.com to sign up to my weekly newsletter. Jazakallah khair.